Ineffa will be our first character from Nod Krai releasing next patch. While her kit looks and sounds amazing at a first glance, there are some things that have me worried not just for Ineffa, but Nod Krai as a whole. So in today's video, we'll analyze Ineffa's kit and calculate how impactful she will or won't be for different teams and units, as well as go over how to best build and invest into her. We'll also give an overall meta-analysis on Ineffa at the end, and address the concerns that I have with her and Nod Krai. Quick note, all the calcs in this video will be using the new calculation standard I mentioned in my community post a while ago. Let's get started. Alright, you've probably heard what Ineffa does by now, but to make sure that we are all on the same page, I'll summarize. She's an AoE Electro sub-DPS unit with an attack scaling shield. The shield lasts for 20 seconds on a 16-second cooldown, so it will have full or nearly full uptime in most teams. The shield's HP is surprisingly high, able to reach between 15 to 19,000 HP, so she's more than capable of acting as your team's sole sustain unit. Ineffa also provides an elemental mastery buff to both herself and your active character based off of her attack. The buff will usually be between 120 to 180 elemental mastery. The buff lasts for 20 seconds, so even long field time characters like Cyno can get full uptime on it. But the big thing with Ineffa is that she turns electro-charged into a new reaction called lunar shock. Essentially what this reaction does is, if enemies are affected by both Hydro and Electro, every 2 seconds they will receive lunar shock damage. What makes this special is, with regular electro-charged, you never know whose stats the reaction damage will use, but with lunar shock, it uses the stats of everyone that applied Hydro or Electro in that 2-second window, so there will never be any ownership issues, and on top of that, it can crit. This sounds like it should result in amazing damage, but it kinda doesn't. This is because the base damage of the reaction is low, about the same as regular electro-charged. Then the formula for how much reaction damage bonus you get from your elemental mastery, it's really bad. The EM scaling on it is even worse than Quicken, which is known for having poor EM scaling. And then the reaction also only hits every 2 seconds, whereas electro-charged hits every second, sometimes even twice per second. So this all results in Lunar Shock not actually contributing much to the team compared to regular electro-charged, which is really disappointing. Instead, the reaction is mainly going to be useful for triggering Ineffa's A1 passive, which gives her skill an additional attack worth 80% of her attack as lunar-charged damage. With this, there's a strange thing in the lunar-charged damage formula where direct forms of lunar-charged damage, such as this passive and Ineffa's C2 and C6, they have their base damage tripled, so this is actually worth 240% of her attack, not 80. And since it's treated as lunar shock damage, which is a transformative reaction, it will ignore the enemy's defense, which sounds amazing because it is, but it being lunar shock means it won't use your regular damage bonus, just the reaction damage percent. Nonetheless, this is where about half of her damage comes from, so it is very important. So in short, you can think of Ineffa somewhat like an electro-charged version of Emily. She's not quite making the reaction itself do good damage, but instead, having the reaction enables her to do extremely high sub-DPS damage, and unlike a character like Emily, Ineffa has additional utility on top of her damage with her shield and EM buffing. So now that we understand Ineffa's kit, let's look into those teams. One unit that should use Ineffa surprisingly well is Neuvillette, using Ineffa in place of either Shallonen or Kazuha. Ineffa's personal damage is very high here, even as solo Electro, and this damage can make up for having less buffing on Neuvillette and Farina, while you also gain a strong shield, which can be great for C0 Neuvillette players. Overall, the DPS is very similar to his current premium team, ever so slightly ahead, so it can be said that this is his new strongest team. It just doesn't really move the needle. But if you need to free up Shallonen for another team, Ineffa gives you a great way of doing so. For Clarant, having a shield in her Taser team can be nice, since the team relies entirely on Clarant's self-healing and Farina's overheal passive for sustain. But the shield can also enable Clarant to use Calamity of Eshu if you don't have a good 5-star weapon. Ineffa also kinda just does a ton of damage here, even more than Clarant. But surprisingly, the team actually has less DPS than using Auroron instead of Ineffa, mainly due to Ineffa giving it a longer rotation time. The shield can definitely make Ineffa better overall, but either way, her overload team is considerably stronger regardless. And now for Cyno, there's quite the dilemma here. You really want to use Farina as his Hydro, but that means you need a healer, and Shallonen isn't great for him since her Res Shred doesn't last his full rotation and she can't scroll both Hydro and Electro, plus you have to give up Dendro to use her. And if you use Baizu, Farina's Hydro application is slow, so you're going to have too much uptime on Quicken and not enough on Lunar Shot, making Ineffa's damage much lower. So instead, what seems like it may be ideal is to use Sync Show instead of Farina, and then also use Nahida in the last slot. Based off some testing, Shinxo's super fast application should allow good uptime on Hydro plus Electro Aura, while also getting a ton of Hyper Blooms and still getting some Aggravates in there as well. So you get a combination of everything, basically. Shinxo's damage reduction will also make Ineffa's shield nearly unbreakable. While this sounds great, having to use Sync Show as the Hydro really holds the team back due to his lack of offensive utility, so this ends up being about the same DPS as his current Quick Bloom team, and a bit less than his Overload team. However, this team has much better vertical scaling potential than those teams, since it is able to invest into both Nahida and Ineffa constellations. With all three 5-stars at C2, the team can actually reach the DPS check for Stygian Onslaught on Dire mode, so that alongside having a shield, I would say this is overall Sino's new best team, but keep in mind the reaction count assumptions here are very shaky, so take it with a grain of salt until post-release testing is done on this team. Aoife is another unit that can use Ineffa well. His reaction damage bonus buff applies to Lunar Shock as well, but it's going to be more like 40% unlike the 300% to give Swirl and Electro-charged. But this is still good because he can provide that buffing on top of 4-piece BV and Hakushin Ring, while also providing the healing needed to use Farina. Overall, the DPS is basically the same as using Fischl in place of Ineffa, but you'll gain a shield and Ineffa's damage is AoE compared to Fischl being single target, so in practice, Ineffa will definitely be better. Ineffa also gives the team a much more room for vertical investment, since otherwise you can only invest in Farina Constellations and 5-star weapons. I also looked into using Ineffa with Raiden. It actually calcs around the same as her Overload team, although as you can see, Raiden herself is doing very low damage here. It's pretty much just being carried by how high Ineffa's damage is. But if you're fine with that, it's definitely a good alternative to Overload to have for Raiden, especially since you don't have to deal with enemies getting knocked all over the place by Overload. There's also of course much better room for vertical investment, since the Overload team doesn't have any other 5-stars you can pull Constellations on. I also calculated this with Pharessa, and as you can guess, it's vastly inferior to her current teams. Overload is obviously raised stronger, but if you didn't want to use Overload for whatever reason, in order to fit Ineffa in, you have to replace Eon-san, and you just simply can't replace Eon-san in a Pharessa team without losing a massive amount of damage, so don't do this. Something else I briefly looked into is possibly using Ineffa with Pyro DPS and Overvape, since they can make good use out of the EM buff. So I calculated this with Linny as an example, but it just doesn't seem worthwhile. Auroran provides way more buffing, and Ineffa is solo Electro here not getting any buffs, so her damage isn't great enough to make up for the difference. Lastly, I looked into possibly just using Ineffa outside of a Lunar Shock entirely, and using her in something like an Arlecchino Overload team instead of Fischl, so that you can have a shield. Although Ineffa is benefiting from Chevrolet's buffs here, her damage is still vastly inferior to Fischl's in this team, since Ineffa won't have her A1 passive, which is the majority of her damage, so she's just not doing good damage, and I wouldn't advise this. And so, those are all the teams I looked into. Overall, I'd say Ineffa is mainly worth picking up for Sino, Neuvillette, Aoife, and Raiden. Just don't expect her to really do much to move the needle for these characters, at least not right now. Let's now look into how to build and invest into Ineffa, starting with her weapons. Her signature is naturally the best for her own damage, while also providing a buff to the whole team's Lunar Shock damage. If you don't pull her weapon, then use the next best stat stick polearm you have. Calamity Crawler is the next best option, providing a ton of attack, which will also make her shield and EM buff a lot larger. If your team has 3 or more elements, then Ballad of the Forge is her best 4-star weapon, otherwise it's Deathmatch. But if you don't buy the Battle Pass, just use Dragon's Bane or Missive Windspear. If you're in a team where Ineffa needs energy recharge, then ER weapons like Engulfing Lightning and Favonius Lance are also good options. Artifacts, right now Ineffa doesn't have great set options. The best bet for now is Gilded Dreams, as she makes use out of both the attack and elemental mastery. If there's no one else on the team using Tenacity, you could also use that for buffing. Otherwise, you can also just use 2-piece set mixes. Note that I would not advise going out of your way to farm a set for Ineffa right now, because more than likely her best set will be released in 6.0. Then for the artifact main stats, the big thing to note here is that you always want an attack goblet, not Electro. This is because most of Ineffa's damage comes from her Ascension 1 passive, which does scale off of her attack, but it does not scale with her electro damage bonus. Plus, on top of it being more damage, the attack goblet will make her shield and EM buff larger. Then for the Sands and Circlet, ideally you'll be using attack Sands and crit Circlet. EM Sands isn't too far behind, but your shield and EM buff will be weaker, so just use attack. But if you have high ER needs on Ineffa in your team, feel free to give her an ER Sands. And for those ER requirements, it varies heavily from team to team, but in double Electro, you can expect to need anywhere from 100% to 150%, then solo Electro, anywhere from 160 to 200%. And now for the Constellations, Ineffa has a pretty strong C1 and C2. The C1 gives the team 50 more reaction damage bonus to Lunar Shock, which will increase Ineffa's damage by a lot since it applies to her A1 passive, and the rest of the team will get a slight buff from it as well. And then C2 basically gives her burst a lot more damage by giving it a large instance of direct Lunar Shock damage, scaling the exact same way as her A1 passive, but with a much larger multiplier. You can expect this to hit over 200,000 damage depending on the team, so it's a really good damage increase. C3 to 5 aren't good, the talent levels don't do much since most of Ineffa's damage comes from her passive. C4 can be useful if your team has high energy requirements on her, but I still wouldn't go for it unless you're going all the way to C6. And then for that C6, it's really strong, giving her much more instances of direct Lunar Shock damage. So overall, C1 and C2 are great early stopping points, and there's no need to go beyond there unless you're going for C6. Your C6 is strong, but more than likely your team would be better off stopping at C2 and then pulling Constellations on someone else on the team instead. And that's just about everything we need to know, so what's the overall analysis? Honestly, although Ineffa's kit itself is good, she really only seems to be worthwhile for a few characters like Neuvillette, Cyno, Raiden, and Aoife, and even then, she's not doing a whole lot to move the needle for them. The main issue is that while Ineffa herself is really good, Lunar Shock is not, and the reaction kinda needs a large buff. If it were up to me, I would probably just double the EM scaling of the reaction so that it's actually doing a good damage. It is, however, worth keeping in mind that Ineffa will likely get a lot better once we're actually in Nod Krai. The artifact sets at the start of a region are always very big for the characters of that region. It's a very real possibility that we will get a support set that provides really good buffing to teams with lunar reactions, hopefully something on par with how good Scroll was for natlan supports. We should also be getting new craftable and battle pass weapons in Nod Krai, so those could make Ineffa better as well. Another thing is, it's currently rumored that instead of an Archon, the focal character of Nod Krai will be a moon goddess. This character is said to be Hydro, so chances are this character will be the premier Hydro support for lunar reaction teams, and be a big upgrade over Farina here. I can definitely see that happening, since they made Ineffa a shielder rather than healer, almost as if they want you to use a different Hydro than Farina, so it would make sense if the moon goddess is the Hydro they want us to use instead. One last thing I have to say is, I'm rather concerned about the whole direct Lunar Shock damage thing. It's fine for Ineffa herself to have this, but I'm concerned because it's said that we're getting a new Electro DPS in 6.0, and this character will almost certainly be designed around Lunar Shock, and so they'll likely have methods of direct Lunar Shock damage in their kit just like Ineffa. And that's a problem to me, because that would basically be a way of allowing the new character to get way more use out of Lunar Shock than existing characters, which, as an enjoyer of old characters, I would not appreciate that at all. The lunar reactions are almost certainly the regional gimmick of Nod Krai, so it's going to be very disappointing if they all end up being designed in a way that makes them way more impactful for newer characters than existing ones. But only time will see how this goes, and I'll try to be optimistic. But I'm curious to know your thoughts, so please let me know in the comments down below. Also be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and feel free to join my Discord where you can communicate with me and my community directly. Thanks, and goodbye.